Well, my special guest today is Congresswoman Katie Porter. Representative Porter represents University Synagogue, the 45th Congressional District in Orange County. As you know, because she has spoken so many times at University Synagogue prior to her election and over the last year and a half in person, she is a dynamic presence in Washington, a star of the class of 2018. She was a former UCI law professor, a consumer protection attorney. She now serves on the House Financial Services Committee, and her concern is for working families, but also for the whole country. That is what her national profile has meant, and it has given voice to the concerns of Orange County citizens as well. And Katie is a wonderful person. So we are so glad to have you with us tonight. I want to ask you first about anti-intellectualism in American life. That's a very old term from about 50 or 60 years ago that sociologists used to use, but it is quite dramatic and disappointing to see that we've become so polarized in the country: anti-science, anti-masks, anti-testing, denial of reality. What do you make of this polarization and this competitiveness of victimhood?
Yeah, so before I dive into that really tough question, I just want to say Shabbat Shalom to everyone. It's wonderful to be joining the University Synagogue community virtually. And I hope that you all are staying safe and are taking care of each other. And I just want to take a moment to express my gratitude to all of the work that this synagogue and so many other faith groups are doing to continue to minister to people, to be a resource, and to bring us together, and not just with the pandemic, but with so many challenges that our country is facing, including this moment of reflection about race relations and policing. And so thank you for having me, for being willing to have these discussions. And I think that willingness to have the discussion is actually the answer to and the response to what you're asking me about with regard to anti-intellectualism or anti-science. So I think a lot of this movement comes from a place of fear. It comes from wanting things to be different than they are. And so one of the ways that I think people cope with being scared is to simply deny the problem. And that, unfortunately, in the case of COVID-19, just risks making the harms more grave. So for everybody who says that they're not going to wear a mask, we're increasing the risk of infection and the very need to all wear masks. And so I think it's really important to remind people of all different political views that no American should be afraid to have debate, to have dialogue, to express their opinion, and that tolerance for those opinions is a fundamental American value. Now, we also have to recognize that we each have a duty to each other, and that government exists in part to impose order onto society to help make sure that we are acting in the collective good, that we are taking care of each other. It's for the public welfare. That really is built into the Constitution. When you go back to the Constitution, and I was recently doing a class with some Boy Scouts called Citizenship in the Nation, and we were looking at this phrase, for the general welfare. Which is really the purpose of the founding of the United States government. And I was talking with those young men about what do we mean by general welfare? And one of the things that came up was trying to keep us safe from this pandemic. So I think it's really important that we try to engage in conversation in a respectful way and recognize that a lot of these very strong reactions, a lot of the pushback on science, when you look back at time, and I don't need to tell you this, Rabbi, you've studied a lot of this, but a lot of the anti-science moments have come at times when people perceive there to be a threat, a big change to society. And so in our country, we're dealing with really severe income inequality and wealth inequality. We're grappling with how to make our country really be the diverse place that it has promised to be in its laws, and that gap between those laws. And so I think this pandemic has sort of been a concrete thing for people to hone in and focus in on, and to take some of their fears and to sort of translate it into how they've reacted to this public health crisis. But
You know,
the truth is, we have to do our best to model the behavior, to acknowledge that we are all in this together, and to say, even if people don't believe that wearing a mask will prevent them from getting sick, it's a gesture of kindness and goodwill to others who feel more comfortable and more safe. And I should say, the science is very clear. Masks seem to be working, but it's true that we don't know everything about this pandemic, which makes it all the more important that we have to try to do what we think works, because we don't have all the answers in the form of a cure or a treatment.
yeah, I understand the impatience that people sometimes have that after being self-isolated for a while, they want to go out and to the beach or restaurants or party or whatever. But I would expect more of leaders. I think that has been the greatest disappointment, that on the federal level, the state level, local level, across the country, there has been not sometimes a disagreement with, sometimes it's been disagreement with the science, but more often it's been a pragmatic opportunism, a lack of courage on the part of political figures who really do believe the science, but are completely afraid to voice what they think will be unpopular. And thus, lives are being lost in incredibly high numbers.
Yeah, no, and it's also fomenting that fear, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think we have to ask ourselves, why would any elected leader want to govern, whether it's at the local, state, or county or federal level? Why would you want to govern over a people in fear? The whole point of governance is to create that security, that community, that sense of welfare, of general welfare. And so how do we do that? We model public health. We give people factual information about how to reduce their risk, and we ask them to take action. And so I think one of the things that concerns me is efforts to try to use the very strong emotional reaction that I think we all feel, scared of losing loved ones, grieving in some cases, either loved ones or grieving sort of the changes that this has meant to our community, the loss of things like, in my case as a mom, school, gathering together to worship, for example. But we shouldn't see elected leaders taking advantage of or trying to foment fear, but instead trying to provide facts, reassurance, and community-oriented action steps that each individual can show to be part of solving this crisis.
Absolutely. So let's talk about another issue that divides society, and that is the hate and the bigotry, the anti-Semitism, the racism that has been with us in a kind of subterranean way sometimes, and then has burst in the last 3 or 3.5 years into the center of the body politic. Incident a couple days ago in Florida, guy yelling white power, what we saw in the streets with Black Lives Matter and the police, and the use of race, not to sensitize us to realize our better angels, so to speak, but the use of race, again, to divide us and foment hatred. How are we going to put that back in the bottle, so to speak? How are we going to make it subterranean again? Even if we can't solve bigotry in America, how can we contain bigotry in America?
I think there's two things that we want to do. We want to stop or try to contain actions of hatred or of bigotry. So those overt acts that put people in harm's way, whether it's anti-Semitic or whether it's racist or otherwise, that action we want to stop. At the same time, we don't want to bury issues of structural racism, issues of discrimination, issues of anti-Semitism, which, as you point out, are centuries and centuries and centuries old, and really go back to some of the fundamental questions about how do we as God's people live together in harmony? And how do we embrace that?
Are you hopeful that something, out of the peaceful protests in the streets, the beginning of the removal of statues, Confederate statues, the change in the Mississippi flag, whatever you want to point to, is this an inflection point, or are we deluding ourselves as we've deluded ourselves so many times in the past that something could really change? I mean, I hope it can really change.
I think it's a delusion to think that in 1 month we will be able to unwind centuries of harm, of structural embedded racism. And I think that's an important thing for people to think about and to understand. So we call it structural racism because it's embedded into how we do things, into the very structures of our society. And so those things are not going to be quick fixes, but what we can begin to do in this moment is to see some of them, to acknowledge some of that, to understand what we do not know about someone else's experience, and to respect that. And so I went to a protest in Irvine. It was extremely peaceful. People were spaced out. And it was really moving to be there. And one of when I first got there, I kneeled down, and a woman came over, staying 6 to 10 feet away from me. And she said, I'm gonna kneel, but if I can't get up, will you help me?
Oh.
And I said, of course. And it was a woman who was in her late 70s, a white woman, and she had a sign. And her sign had only one word on it. And it said, listen, which is really powerful.
Yeah.
Now, it's not enough to listen. We also have to commit to taking action. So it's really important for people to think about this as an ongoing, ever-present challenge for society. To listen to those who are different than us, to value their experiences, and then to think about how do we change our actions, both individually, and how do we as citizens and members of a society change our action. And when you think about what's going on with, we've seen in vivid detail, Black people lose their lives in police custody. And that is antithetical to the purpose of the police, which is to protect, and that includes to protect those who are in their custody. And so we all should be wanting our police officers to have tools and changes to laws, to equipment, to policies, to community norms that will let them better do their job of keeping us all safe.
Do you think that terms like, or slogans like, defund the police or abolish ICE, do you think, I understand what defund the police means. It doesn't mean never have any police. It means a realignment of the budgets. But do you think that alienates the other side, the non-progressive side, who all of a sudden when they hear abolish or defund, that perpetuates this sense of, well, we can't trust liberals because they're going to go overboard?
I think people tend to pour into those slogans their a priori assumptions. So I think for people who are concerned about law enforcement, about community safety, and look, we all should want that.
Yeah.
That's a big reason why we love living in Orange County. I've often said, nobody moved to Irvine for the nightlife. We moved here for the quality of life, and the safety of our community is part of that, but so is the diversity of our community. So is being a place that is welcoming to all kinds of people. And so I think anytime you have a slogan, you're going to see people playing often in both directions, trying to use it as a litmus test. Are you with us or are you against us? And really trying to use the slogan to divide. I think the goal ought to be to say to people, what do you want to accomplish? What is the change that you want to see? And what are the tools that we could use to get there? And this is really the work of Congress when it's doing its job well. It's not to chant slogans or embrace demonizing one party or the other. It's to come up with concrete ideas, to debate them, and then to ask ourselves, will these ideas move us forward? And how will we know if they're moving us forward? And I think one of the really important parts about the policing debate is that it is not new, this problem of police brutality. It is not new. And the risk the disproportionate risk to Black Americans is not new. It is embedded in the structural history of this country, including slavery and Jim Crow and prison chain gangs. And so I think the question is, what does it mean to have a just policing system? And for me, it means that our police are keeping us safe, including keeping those safe who are in their custody, because that is part of our system of justice. That's part of what makes me safe as a citizen, is that I am safe because we have a police system that should be struggling toward justice. And so the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, I was back here, I'm in here in Washington right now, where we're filming this, and I voted for that last week, and it does take a number of concrete steps. But I do think just as much as we in Orange County in particular want these overt acts of hate, whether they're anti-Semitic or racist, anti-Chinese, anti-our API community, which has been really struggling with a lot of hatred. We want those actions to stop, but we can't submerge the conversation. We have to be brave enough to keep talking about the realities that we perceive others as different than ourselves. And that is an ongoing, lifelong struggle to understand those who we perceive as different.
One of the issues that overlaps this issue of racism is voter suppression. Voting irregularities, polls being closed, shrinking the number of polls, not encouraging mail-in ballots, names dropped from registration lists, voting machine failures, and on the larger issue, gerrymandering in general, right? All of these issues have conspired to not make America a place where each human being's vote counts. So what do you think we can do about that on a societal level? And how can we urge people to believe in the vote enough that they go and vote and don't despair?
Yeah, this is another example of a structural thing. Voter suppression didn't start with the election of Donald Trump. Gerrymandering or efforts to push people away from the polls didn't begin 10 years ago or 2 years ago. Democracy is a struggle. And we actually can look to Israel to see that, I think, as one example of another democracy that is engaged in an ongoing struggle to find that balance, to deal with the consequences as well as the sort of rewards of elected leadership. And so, I think one of the things that's been underappreciated with all of the focus on COVID, particularly and on testing, on PPE, on protecting essential workers, is that the CARES Act that Congress passed contained tens of millions of dollars of funding for election security assistance, because it will be in a lot of areas where they're not used to voting by mail, where that has not historically been a way that people voted. They do need more resources to do that, and Congress has stepped up to the plate. I think one of the ways that we can help as Californians is we're familiar with voting by mail. It's become more popular in California in recent years. And in this past primary election, every registered voter in Orange County got a mail-in ballot. So one of the things that we know is that when you have mail-in ballots, it sometimes takes a long time to count them. And that is a signal that our democracy is strong. It's a signal that there were a lot of people who wanted their voice to be heard. It is the fact that it takes the registrar of voters time to count those ballots is because he's validating the safety and security of our election. And so I think one of the things that I see in this sort of instant reward kind of moment we're in, if we just hit refresh enough times on Twitter, it will come to be, is that elections and election results will take longer in a vote by mail world. And that's where we're going to be in November. And that cannot be used to undermine the results of the election. So a result that takes a week is a signal that there was more time, more care, more efforts to verify and validate and ensure that people's votes were correctly counted. And so we need to be a little bit patient, I think, about that. And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of people because of the level of participation, the level of engagement that we're going to see in November.
Since you mentioned Israel, let's talk about that as well. It could happen any day. It might not happen any day. Prime Minister Netanyahu's proposed annexation of part of the West Bank. Israelis are terribly divided on this, just like American Jews and Americans in general are. Europeans are pretty much against it. I think it would be terribly destructive to Israel in making any kind of hoped for peace with the Palestinians and a two-state solution. The Democrats have very bravely, I have to say, run the risk of having Republicans use this as a wedge issue by so many people, including yourself, signing on to saying no to annexation. Because I can see the potential politically for them to say, oh, the Democrats don't care about Jews. So I'm not asking you now, a partisan question. I'm just saying that's sort of a sidebar of this. But why do you not favor annexation? What are you worried about could happen as a result of annexation? And how do we get from, and this is a question that's more than 50 years old since after the '67 war, how do we get from where we are to any kind of peace table, a two-state solution, to some kind of reconciliation?
One of the problems with annexation and this risk of annexation that we're dealing with right now is that it makes Israel less secure. And so the reason to oppose annexation is that even though we might all acknowledge that a negotiated two-state solution, we don't know exactly which settlements and which lines will be agreed on by the parties, but it is that agreement rather than unilateral action which will help keep Israel safe. And you can look at the group Commanders for Israel Security and look at, it's a group composed of very high level, I think over 80% of former Israel brigadier generals or higher are part of this group. And what they say in their reports is annexation will increase the risk to Israel. It will make Israelis and the state of Israel less safe and less secure. And so the premise, a lot of the premise of US national aid to Israel, of this bilateral relationship, is to help ensure that Israel is secure, is safe, that it's making the region more stable and safe. And so we should be pushing back on acts by Israel that would be counter to that goal. And so it's also, you think you're right to acknowledge that the people of Israel themselves are very divided on this issue. And so we have to recognize that Israel is a democracy, that their leader may or may not take steps that we think are in the country's best interests. And we have an obligation to speak up and say, we think that's going to make you less safe. And that is really important to us, to stand with you as your ally in good times and bad, to help make you more secure. And this act, we believe, will isolate you from your allies in Europe, will make you less secure, and will push back the prospects for coming back to the peace table. Ultimately, when can that peace process really begin in a robust way again? I think it's going to take the people of Israel making different choices with their democracy, and it's going to take the people of the United States making different choices with their democracy to kind of reset some of those peace talks. But I am a believer that the lasting peace that the Israeli people and people of that region deserve can only come from a negotiated two-state solution and cannot come through unilateral force. And when you look back at the world order, really since World War II, one of the principles of international law has been that you do not and cannot take territory by force. that is a sort of canonical principle of international law. And so I think for Israel to do that would then separate Israel from its closest allies in terms of having a shared set of principles about how we govern ourselves and how we relate to other countries.
Is there more that the United States can do, the Congress or the government in general over time, to facilitate that future peace? I mean, right now it's by saying no, but what can happen next where they can say yes? How do we bring the parties together? Many years ago, I worked in the State Department as a White House fellow, and I saw how impossible it was, really impossible, to get half a dozen people from each side around a table, literally talking about the shape of the table. So what else can the U.S. do to move the parties towards peace?
Well, I think one of the things we're doing, and you alluded to this, is allowing ourselves as elected leaders and allowing the American people to have a more vibrant conversation about what does support for Israel look like? And there's not just one way to think about that question, even among Israeli Jews, as you mentioned, much less among all of the people of Israel. And so I think, to the extent that there is an effort to silence that dialogue or to limit that debate, that is actually really slowing down our ability to come up with solutions and ways that we can help support. But I do think that Israel as a nation needs to lead that relationship. We need to be a trusted partner. We need to continue to provide aid and bilateral relationships with Israel and to be there with them through thick and thin as they struggle with this challenge. And that's part of what it means to be an ally. But at the same time, allies aren't afraid to be honest with each other. Allies aren't afraid to say, I think that's a mistake. I think that would go the wrong direction. Here's what concerns me about that. And so I think it's progress that we are not stifling this conversation and that we're allowing a full range of debate in the United States Congress about how do we best protect Israel, keep it secure, recognize its strategic importance, and recognize the personal importance of Israel to many Americans.
Katie, Representative Porter, I want to thank you so much for your time. I know how busy you are. We're very honored that you are here with us on Shabbat. I would wish you a happy July 4th, and thank you for representing us so well.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to being able to come together with you all in person. I know everybody says this to you every day, but I just want to remind everyone, please, if you can, stay home, stay safe. Your actions really are an expression of love and kindness that you're putting out into this world for our entire community. So thank you for continuing to do that.
Thank you, Katie. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.